Hello, my name is Sheila Evans, and this is my Great Moments in Art Education project. The name of the project is Central Midwestern Regional Education Laboratories and the Aesthetic Education Program. In the 1960s, art education was lacking and sometimes even non-existent within the general education curriculum. Parents, administrators, and sometimes non-art teachers were often asking, why is art important to education? Who could blame them for this question? The 1960s, even into the 1970s, was a time of uncertainty and change. During this time period, the Vietnam War, threats of nuclear bombing, and even the death of a president created fear. At the same time, change was on the horizon, with marches for equality and protests in support of the civil rights movement. Even education seemed to be changing as the United States began its race for space with the USSR. Still, the best answer for as to why art education should be included came as a simple answer, stated in the abstract of a Department of Education plan for the establishment of a pilot aesthetic education program in cooperation with selected schools, CEMREL, and other interested agencies. It stated that an individual's education should prepare him for a life of quality in all respects. However, how to proceed with being able to provide opportunities for a life of quality begins with a series of conferences, one corporation, and the development of one specific education program. Now, when referring to the aesthetic program, it is important to note that it includes all forms of art education, such as music, dance, theater, and art. In 1965, there were several conferences being held due to the educators' concerns of aesthetic education in the general education curriculum of that time. The first conference that got the ball rolling was the Seminar in Art Education for Research and Curriculum Development held at the Pennsylvania State University under the direction of Edward Mattel. It was at this conference that the aesthetic education program began to develop. It was not until the conference held at the Whitney Museum of American Art that a decision was made to seek funding from the Central Midwestern Regional Education Laboratory, also known as CEMREL. Before the development of a curriculum for aesthetic education, subjects such as art were being taught more in a training style geared towards turning out professionals. One of the goals for the aesthetic education brought on by CEMREL and the aesthetic education program was to develop an aesthetic education curriculum that was appropriate for elementary school levels. The first step was to write a sort of guideline for the curriculum to follow, a guideline that could be implemented and revised. This led to the writing of Guidelines Curriculum Development for Aesthetic Education by Manuel Birkin, Laura H. Chapman, and Evan J. Kern. This publication was funded by CEMREL Incorporation along with Ohio State University and Arts and Humanities Program of O&E, the publication of which was then distributed to colleges, universities, state departments of education, and local school systems. The reason for the distribution of the publication to these educational systems was so that they could help develop the curriculum, which led to the next step of testing the new guidelines. One of the biggest key elements that helped lead to the success of the development of the aesthetics education program was that CEMREL employed people with education backgrounds as well as involved teachers in the creating of the curriculum. CEMREL was the agency that held the funding for the program, and another aspect was to create centers for teachers to receive training on how to implement the aesthetic lesson within their curriculum. These teacher education centers also served as dual purpose of developing and testing teaching materials that would be used within the curriculum. Another unique aspect of the curriculum was that the aesthetic program was divided up by disciplines such as science or math. This was done so that there could be more of a focus on the aesthetic experience of that particular discipline. For example, a student may experience how they feel when they look at a painting. A review by Ralph A. Smith and a study by Sam Reese, which was reviewed by Leon C. Carl, deemed CEMREL's work in the aesthetic education program a success to some degree. However, Reese's study does mention that the aesthetic education program was not a cure-all for the lack of arts education within the curriculum. In the review by Carl, Reese feels that the reason arts education was still not being accepted as a standard within elementary schools was because institutions that prepared teachers for elementary schools were giving very little, if any, instruction in the ways of arts education. However, despite this, CEMREL's work was still overall beneficial in training teachers in aesthetic education. And these are my photo references.